consensus participants. And so as a rational block proposer, you might want to delay your block proposal, while obviously still making sure that you end up being part of the canonical chain. And yeah, I guess the reason is obvious, because you want to make extract more MEV. But we'll get to the details a bit more. I want to first set up, provide a bit of context. So blockchain protocols are typically evaluated through the lens of their ability to maintain liveness and safety. Liveness being the characteristic of essentially just regularly adding new transactions into the chain. And then safety is about securing the position of those transactions within the chain. So you essentially don't want, once you put in a transaction, it shouldn't go out again, essentially. And that's what we usually study these protocols through. And what we're kind of arguing for in this paper is also to consider economic fairness. I feel like, I mean, it's obviously, this is not a sort of new idea, it's very implicit kind of, obviously we care about economic fairness, because what that means essentially is we want economic fairness amongst consensus participants, because if we don't have that, we'll have essentially centralization of the validation set over time. But it does help to kind of formulate that more explicitly with the idea of essentially the idea is to model rational behavior within these protocols. And more specifically, because typically in the consensus literature, what you have is that you model either honest or Byzantine behavior. So either you're totally honest, or you can do whatever the hell you want, even to your own detriment. And essentially, rational behavior then maybe allows us to, if we model rational behavior, we can maybe get to this economic fairness more explicitly in our modeling. And so what that essentially means is we want our protocol to have, with the honest specifications of the protocol should be maximally profitable. So that the participants essentially have no incentive to deviate, and to make sure that there's, otherwise a deviating participant can outcompete an honest participant. Now, the more metaphorical way of looking at it is essentially we want these beautiful setups. I think I saw David even here some earlier, so he has a good setup. But we essentially want this beautiful home staking to be maximally profitable and be able to compete with centralized, or not centralized staking, but with professional staking institutions. And this is essentially what peak performance should look like. That's kind of what we're trying to get at in a nutshell. But our friend MEV tends to have a say in these things, and we've grown to love and hate it, but essentially makes things a bit more tricky for designing protocols. And yeah, the intuition, again, quite straightforward. MEV accrues over time as users submit transactions. And so when a block proposer waits a bit longer, there's more transactions in the mempool, so they can construct more profitable blocks, etc. So what we then did in this paper essentially is investigate the possibility for block proposers to delay their block for as long as possible, while still ensuring they become part of the canonical chain. What does this concretely look like in Ethereum? So here we have a slot. Time is divided into slots in Ethereum, 12 seconds long each. And so the honest protocol says that a block proposer should propose a block at 0 seconds into the slot, so right at the beginning. Now, when they do that, like here roughly, then the attesters, whenever they see a valid block, they immediately attest. If they don't hear a block, they wait until the attestation deadline, which is at 4 seconds into the slot, and then they attest. But so here, the block's on time, they see the block immediately, and so they immediately attest. Business as usual. But let me introduce you to King Louis XIV. He likes power, and he also likes money. And so he's wondering what he can do with this power that he has. Because essentially, in proof of stake, block proposing is a monopoly. It's a very short-lived monopoly, but it's a monopoly nonetheless. And what he's basically doing is he's using the fact that there is this time interval from 0 to 4 seconds that he can use to buy himself time, essentially. Because the testers, they wait until 4 seconds if they don't hear a block before, and only then they test. So essentially, here what he's doing is he's proposing so late that he's just about accumulating 40% of the committee votes, which is a threshold. Let's not get into the fork choice details, but basically because of proposer boost, you need to at least accumulate 40% to not be reorgable by the next block proposer. So what you want to do is you want to propose your block maximally late so that while still ensuring that at least 40% of your of the committee hears you in time for them to vote for you. And that's basically the game. And so what we then did in this paper is, and I'm not going to go into the equations, but we kind of formalized this problem by modeling the value of time to consensus participants. And it's essentially a game between block proposers and the testers. Block proposers propose blocks, testers vote for blocks, and the payoff for proposers is increasing in time. So that's kind of trying to capture this notion of, essentially MEV making it so that time is valuable to consensus participants. And then a tester's votes need to be correct and fresh. Correct meaning they vote for the block that ends up in part of the canonical chain, and fresh meaning they can't just vote 5 slots later because then they will be sure that they're voting correctly, because in Ethereum, essentially your votes need to be included within the next block for the head vote to be rewarded. And so essentially you have this kind of trade-off where proposers want to wait as long as possible, but obviously they need to make sure they're early enough. And sort of the same dynamic applies to the testers. They want to wait as long as possible because that gives them more information, which allows them to vote correctly. But at the same time, they need to make sure their votes are heard early enough for the next proposer to hear them. And because of latency in the network, you have this kind of trade-off for both parties. And then in the paper, we kind of formally show that testers can coordinate to implement proposers acting at any particular time. And what this means is essentially that any deadline, attestation deadline chosen by the attesters could be in equilibrium, to which then the block proposer has to kind of adhere. And in Ethereum's case, practically speaking, we have these consensus clients, and when we download them, essentially, the attestation deadline is at 4 seconds, which does serve as this very powerful Schelling point. But it could be something else potentially. And what's interesting about this model is that we've introduced payoff functions and can model rational consensus participation, which usually, again, like it's not the first time that that people think about rational behavior, of course, but it usually isn't part of the way we model consensus. But since we do care about decentralization so much, it might be an avenue worth investigating further. And so this kind of timing game is a particular instance which somewhat does hint at some neat abstraction, but I think, modeling rational behavior in these consensus models is definitely, at least in my opinion, interesting to look at further. And that's kind of the paper on the theory side. Do read it. It's obviously a lot more detailed and more formal in the paper. But I want to now also talk about the empirical side, because the second part of the paper is essentially us looking at the Ethereum network and looking at potential timing games. So are they worth playing, and to what extent are they being played? And to get into that, maybe like a very quick run through of MEV Boost. Barnaby mentioned it. It's like, I think around 95% now run MEV Boost, and MEV Boost is essentially this idea of outsourcing the block building that a validator usually does to some specialized party. And so we have these block builders that bid for the right to build the execution payload for the proposer. And so the auction for the content of block n begins actually in slot n-1. And so as time goes on and new transactions come in, the builders are able to build more profitable blocks. And so they start bidding more, they start bidding higher because they can build more profitable blocks, so they can afford to bid more for the right to build that block. And so as time goes on, we have an increase in bid, and these bids are submitted to what's called a relay, and the relay sits between the block proposer and the block builder, because it's essentially a trust facilitator, if you will. And yeah, I mean, Barnaby was talking about it. I mean, there's this idea of enshrining this to essentially remove that trust component of the relay. And so eventually then the proposer goes to the relay and requests the highest bid, probably signs it, and then the block is eventually released. We collected a few timestamps that I'll be talking about in a bit, but so we collected more than 150 million bits over, I think, like roughly 5 weeks in March, April this year. And the first question we ask is, are timing games worth it? And the answer is quite clearly yes. And I think the absolute value was something like 0.0065 ETH per second, meaning that, yeah. But I think the more important point is not the absolute value, but noting that it's a very positive linear relationship. So as time goes on, we can build more profitable blocks. So time is valuable to consensus participants. And so yeah, the TLDR of this plot here, so what we did is we looked at all bits, so all 150 million bits, and see how they evolve over the course of over time, essentially. And then the next obvious question is, are these timing games being played, right? And so what we see here is that we look at different timestamps. Received at is when the winning, so now we're looking at winning bits, only winning bits. So here we see a distribution of the winning bits. They're received on average roughly just after the what's it called? The new slot begins. And the legible we can maybe ignore for now. And what we then see is that they're signed out, which we use as a kind of proxy for when the block's released. Because once the proposer signs a block, they're kind of locked in. The only way is that they could deviate is by making themselves slushable. But basically what we see here is there's quite a large discrepancy between when a block's received, which is roughly on time, the winning bits roughly received, which is roughly on time, and then when the block's actually signed and released on the P2P layer. And we did investigate this a bit in more detail in the paper, but essentially the short version is that large staking entities such as Coinbase and Kraken have a somewhat slow signing process. So it's kind of internal latency, if you will. So they request the winning bid almost on time, and then, or like on average, I'm talking. And then for some reason it takes a long time for them to sign it and release it. But the point here is that what's coming here? So the point is that timing games are worth playing, and they are being played, but they're not really being played consciously. Like the intention does not seem to be, let me extract as much MEV as possible, and that's why I'm delaying my block proposal. But instead, it seems to be mostly the late blocks that we see are largely due to some internal latency. And the point is, because it's possible, this could of course change over time. I mean, these entities obviously have reputation, and so and it's very attributable. But obviously, that's not a very good line of defense. To put it that way. So that was the first part of this talk. And I want to now talk a bit about this impossibility of incentive incompatibility. Incentive compatibility. And I mean, essentially, I'm going to try and intuitively argue for this claim here. A proof-of-stake protocol cannot achieve economic fairness amongst rational consensus participants with heterogeneous resources. Sounds a bit constructed, it is. Let's kind of go through it step by step. So that's the claim. First question, what does fair even mean? So the way I kind of loosely use it here is this idea of we want validators that are performing good enough to be maximally profitable. That's at least the intention with which Ethereum historically has been designed. The idea is you should have some leeway of having sort of quote-unquote shitty hardware and not be punished too severely for it. And essentially, we want home staking to be competitive. Now, on the high level, before going into the specifics, given any time interval that a block proposer has, so what I mentioned earlier, the 0 to 4 seconds, essentially is a time interval that the block proposer has in which they can propose a block and realistically still become canonical. Obviously, they can also wait a bit longer, but then they will likely just not end up part of the chain. And so given this interval of time, a rational proposer and a rational actor will propose as late as possible, thanks to the MEV, basically. And they need to make sure it still becomes canonical. And so now the point is that a sophisticated actor will be able to do this better. And when I say sophisticated, I'm basically thinking someone with special know-how, hardware, fancy hardware setups, sophisticated P2P strategies to make sure that they can release the blocks from, say, multiple positions in the P2P layer so that they can essentially reach more attesters more quickly. And the argument is that this is centralizing and obviously bad in the long run. And now a bit more specific. So any proof-of-stake system clearly needs a mechanism for determining the block proposers. And because it's proof of stake, this random selection must be done explicitly based on the stake distribution of its kind of bonded consensus participants. I think so far so good. So if we assume we have this sort of sequence of block proposing duties. So validator 1 is supposed to propose block 1, validator 2 proposing block 2, etc. The question is, how do we move through this list of duties? And the most obvious one is, let's just cycle through it, right? Let's start with the first and then just go through it. Well, that obviously runs into the obvious problem that you need to be resilient to a adversary plus someone that's offline. So you need a way to recover in case someone goes offline. Otherwise, the protocol is stuck. So we need to stay live. And so this is kind of where then time enters the chat. And what I like loosely call deterministic time in the proof of stake setting. So in proof of work, we have this exogenous randomness essentially fed into the system that creates entirely different dynamics. But here, because we have this on-chain pseudo-randomness that we have or need, we need a way of staying live. And so what we essentially do is we schedule these duties and we say, if you don't show up, we're going to move on. But in this P2P setting, you can't, it's not like a block proposal can only be valid in one instance. You need essentially this time interval. And in Ethereum, we have these fixed 12-second time intervals. There's other ways of doing it. The PBFT type of protocols, what they usually do is, let's move on as soon as we can, but if we cannot move in within some sort of timeout, then we go to the next round anyhow. And it's slightly different, but honestly it's same but different. The dynamics are exactly the same. The block proposer can just like max out that time interval until the timeout, or in Ethereum's case, the attestation deadline. And then now, given this kind of time interval and the fact that we have a monopoly of the proposer, yeah, we basically have this short-lived monopoly which the proposer can abuse by doing these strategic timing games. And again, like I talked about it, a sophisticated actor can do this better. I think I'm running out of time. I'm not sure. So maybe just to, this is again the kind of baseline statement I was making. A proof of stake protocol cannot achieve economic fairness amongst rational consensus participants with heterogeneous resources. Hopefully that statement makes a bit more sense now. I mean, one should note, like, it's a very drastic statement, and obviously it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. The point is, the question obviously is also, how bad is this problem? Like, maybe the home staker can not do it as well, but almost as good, and how bad is it? But I think it makes sense to be at least conscious about these dynamics and appreciate the fact that proof of work is very different here to proof of stake. And if we could maybe somehow replicate the proof of work dynamics, which unfortunately I'm not sure is possible, but yeah, long story short, I think it's healthy to think about it. And I mean, there's a bunch of things what one can think and do about it potentially. Usually most of these ideas have their limitations. I'm not going to go through it because I think I'm over time. Thank you for listening, and yeah, do reach out, and yeah, thank you very much.
Does someone have question? It's time. Put your hands up.
It's not a question, it's a joke. Were you effectively time attacked there? Jude, it's question time. Little bit. Okay. Were you effectively just time attacked there? Sorry? Were you effectively just attacked by time there? Yeah, exactly.